Before I begin, if you've ever lived through something like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network because telling this story still feels like walking barefoot over broken glass, and I could use the company. I grew up in a house where words were tools, and the sharpest one was the nickname my parents gave me before I was old enough to understand it, the burden. They never said it with a laugh. It wasn't a joke you could pretend not to hear. It was a label delivered in the same tone you'd use to name a stain that wouldn't come out of the carpet. I remember being 7 and standing in the kitchen while my mother counted bills, the yellow light making her face look tired and older than her years, and she sighed like the air had weight to it and said, "If it weren't for the burden, we could breathe." I didn't know she meant me at first. I thought maybe there was something wrong with the house. Then my father looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug, didn't correct her, and that's how I learned. After that, the word followed me like a shadow that learned my shape. When I forgot my homework, when I needed new shoes, when I got sick and missed school, when the electricity bill came and my father's jaw tightened, there it was, floating in the room. "We do our best," he'd say, "but we carry a burden." They never hit me. They never starved me. That almost made it harder because I didn't have a clean story to tell anyone, just 1,000 small moments that taught me to apologize for existing. I learned to walk quietly, to measure my hunger, to fold my wants into neat little squares and tuck them away where no one could trip over them. I learned to be grateful for silence and terrified of it at the same time because silence meant they were counting. In school, teachers said I was bright, but I kept my hand down. I didn't want to bring attention home like a bill. I took a job at 16 and gave most of the money to my mother without being asked, the way you slide a plate towards someone who looks hungrier than you. My younger brother, Ethan, was different. He was the miracle. That's what my mother called him, even when she was angry at him, even when he broke things. The word wrapped around him like a soft blanket. I don't blame him for that. He didn't ask for it any more than I asked to be the other thing. But I noticed how my parents' faces changed when he came into a room, how their shoulders loosened, how the air got lighter. When I came in, it was like someone checked the weather and found a storm. There were rules in our house that weren't written down. Don't cost money, don't make noise, don't need things. And the biggest one, don't ask why. Because when I did, when I was about 12 and finally brave or tired enough to ask my mother why she called me that, she pressed her lips together and said, "You wouldn't understand," which is a way of saying I don't want to explain. My father said, "We all carry our share," and then he changed the subject to Ethan's soccer practice, so I learned to carry mine quietly. By the time I was 22, the word felt like it had been stamped into my bones. I was in college on a patchwork of scholarships and shifts at a cafe that smelled like burnt sugar and wet coats, and I called home once a week because that's what good children do, even when they're tired of proving they deserve the phone call. The family reunion that year was my Aunt Clara's idea. She had the kind of optimism that felt like a dare, the kind that made you believe people could be better if you just put enough folding chairs in a circle and fed them potato salad. She rented out the community hall by the river and sent invitations like olive branches. I almost didn't go. I told myself I had work. I told myself I had studying. What I really had was a tight place in my chest that got tighter every time I pictured my parents introducing me with that look that said, "Here is the problem we solved by enduring it." But Ethan texted me a picture of the river with the caption, "You comin' or what?" And I didn't want to be the person who always said no, so I packed a bag and took the bus that smelled like vinyl and old conversations. The hall was already loud when I arrived, voices bouncing off the high ceiling, the clatter of plates, the hum of a cheap speaker playing songs that made people my parents' age nod and smile at memories. Aunt Clara hugged me like she meant it, like my ribs were something she wanted to protect. "You look thinner," she said, and then, seeing my face, added, "In a good way, you look lighter." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. My parents were near the back, my mother arranging napkins with the focus of someone building a small, precise wall, my father talking to Uncle Ray about gas prices. When they saw me, my mother's smile flickered on and off like a bulb with a loose wire. "You made it," she said. "We were just saying it's been expensive lately." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. The day moved the way these days always do, in loops of small talk and careful jokes, in the rhythm of people who share blood and not always much else. I helped set up chairs, then helped take them down, then helped wash dishes because I'm good at being useful in the quiet ways that don't get noticed. Ethan told me about his job, about his girlfriend, about how he might move. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. And he said, "You always say that," like it was a fact about the weather. At some point, Aunt Clara tapped a spoon against a glass and said she had a surprise. "We're not getting any younger," she said, smiling in that brave way, "and I found some things that reminded us of who we were." She held up an old camcorder and a stack of tapes, and the room made a collective sound, half laugh, half groan. "Just a few minutes," she promised, "for memory's sake." Someone dimmed the lights. The screen was a white sheet tacked to the wall, and when the first shaky image appeared, people leaned forward like they were meeting old friends. There was my mother, younger, her hair darker, laughing at something off camera. There was my father, thinner, holding Ethan as a baby. The room warmed with nostalgia. I felt myself relax in that way you do when the past is far enough away to be a story instead of a bruise. Then the camera angle changed and the sound got clearer, and I heard my mother's voice say, "We can't keep pretending, he's too much." Someone coughed, thinking it was a joke. I felt my hands go cold. The camera wobbled and my father said, "Lower your voice," and she said, "Why? It's the truth. We can't afford him. He's a burden." The word landed in the room like a dropped plate. The screen showed a kitchen I recognized, our kitchen, before the cabinets were repainted, before the crack in the wall by the window got bigger. I was small in the background, sitting on the floor with blocks, not looking at the camera. My aunt's voice came from behind it, younger too, saying, "He's just a kid." And my mother said, "So was I once, and nobody carried me." The room went quiet in a way I had never heard it go quiet before. Not polite quiet, not waiting for a punchline quiet, the kind of quiet that means everyone is in the same place at the same time, and that place is uncomfortable. Someone coughed. The tape kept going. My father rubbed his face and said, "We'll manage," and my mother said, "We always manage, but I'm tired of pretending it costs us." The camera turned away then, to a window, to light on dust, to nothing important, and my aunt's hand must have been shaking because the image blurred. She stood up too fast, said, "I'm so sorry," and reached for the player, but my uncle said, "Wait," in a voice I didn't recognize, and the room stayed still like it was holding its breath. I sat there and felt something I didn't have a word for yet, something between relief and grief, like finding a letter you didn't know you'd been waiting for and realizing it's addressed to you in handwriting you recognize. My parents didn't look at me. My mother stared at the floor. My father stared at the screen like it might argue with him. Ethan looked at me, his mouth open, then closed, then said my name like he was testing whether it still worked. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions and not hear the answers. The tape clicked off and the room filled with the sound of chairs and people and the river outside like life insisting on continuing. Aunt Clara kept saying, I didn't know," which was both true and not. My mother finally said that was private, as if privacy could put the word back where it came from. My father said it was a long time ago, like time is an eraser that works on everything. I didn't say anything because my voice had gone somewhere I couldn't reach yet. But inside me, something had shifted. The shadow had a source now. The nickname had a birthday. And for the first time, I wondered what else I wasn't supposed to hear. I remember the way the room rearranged itself after the tape stopped. like everyone suddenly needed a different place to stand to keep their balance. People pretended to look for napkins or their phones or the exit, the way you do when you don't want to be seen witnessing something that doesn't belong to you. Aunt Clara kept wringing her hands, apologizing into the air. My mother sat very still, as if any movement might break whatever fragile thing she was holding together inside her. My father's jaw worked like he was chewing a thought that refused to go down. Ethan moved closer to me without asking, like he was afraid if he didn't, I might dissolve into the floor. "Hey," he said quietly, which was a lot of things at once. I finally stood up because sitting felt like agreeing to stay small, and I was tired of that. "I'm going to get some air," I said, though what I really meant was, I'm going to find out if I still exist when nobody's calling me anything. The river was gray and patient, doing what rivers do, and the breeze off it smelled like wet leaves and old stone. I leaned on the railing and counted my breaths until my hand stopped shaking. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I didn't turn right away because I wanted to choose who I'd be when I did. It was my father. He stood a careful distance away, like he was afraid of spooking a wild animal. "It wasn't meant for you," he said, which is a sentence that sounds like comfort until you realize it's also an admission. "But you said it," I replied, and my voice surprised me by being steady. He nodded, looking at the water instead of me. "We were young. We were scared. Money was always tight." I waited for something else, some word that might build a bridge, but he stopped there, as if fear and money were complete sentences. "You called me that for years," I said, "not just once." He sighed, and for a moment I thought he might say my name the way he used to say Ethan's, like it was a good thing to have in his mouth. "We didn't mean to hurt you," he said instead, which is what people say when they've decided the most important thing is how they feel about what they did. "It still did," I said, and then I did turn to look at him because I wanted him to see that sentence land. He looked older in that light, lines I hadn't noticed before, a man who had spent a long time convincing himself that surviving was the same as living. "Your mother is proud in her way," he added, as if that could be a consolation prize. I thought about all the times I'd brought home grades and pay stubs and quiet successes, like offerings left at a shrine that never answered back. "In her way," I repeated. We stood there in a silence that was no longer heavy, but hollow, and I realized something that felt like both a loss and a release. Whatever apology I'd been hoping for wasn't coming today, maybe not ever. Ethan came out a minute later and handed me a bottle of water like it was a peace treaty. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear. If I had—" He didn't finish because there are some sentences that can't be completed without changing the past, and we don't get to do that. "It's not your fault," I told him, and for once that felt like a sentence I could mean without qualifying it. He nodded, eyes bright in a way that wasn't just the light. "You're coming back in, right?" he asked. I thought about the hall, the faces, the tape, the word hanging in the air like dust you can't unsee. "In a minute," I said. When I did go back, the day had found an awkward way to continue. Plates clinked, someone turned the music back on, too loud, then too quiet. Aunt Clara caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," again, and I nodded because I didn't want her to carry what wasn't hers. My mother still hadn't looked at me. I felt a strange calm settle in, the kind that comes after you realize the storm has already done its worst, and now you're just counting what's left standing. People left in ones and twos the way they always do when a gathering is past the point of pretending to be only what it said it was. When we finally said our goodbyes, my mother hugged me like she was checking a box. My father said, "Drive safe," even though I was taking the bus. Ethan squeezed my shoulder and said, "Text me," and I said I would because some promises are easy. The ride back to my apartment felt longer, like the city had added a few extra miles just to see what I'd do with them. I kept replaying the tape in my head, not the words so much as the tone, the tired certainty in my mother's voice when she said my name without saying it. I wondered how many other rooms I'd been in where the same sentence had been spoken and I hadn't heard it. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about a shoebox I remembered from the top of my parents' closet, the one with the peeling sticker of a cartoon rocket on it. It had always been just old stuff, the kind of answer that tells a child not to ask again. By morning, the idea had turned into a plan that felt reckless and necessary at the same time. I texted Ethan and asked if he was still in town. He said yes. I asked if he could meet me at the house. There was a pause, then a why. I typed, I need to see something, and he sent back a thumbs up, which is the digital equivalent of a deep breath. The house looked the same from the outside, paint a little faded, the front steps still crooked in that way my father always said he'd fix when he had time. Inside, it smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner and the years we'd spent learning how to live around each other. My mother was out, which Ethan said in the careful way you use when you're not sure whether absence is a gift or a risk. We went to the hallway closet. The shoebox was still there, like it had been waiting for permission. My hand shook when I pulled it down, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I was afraid of what I wouldn't find. Inside were folded papers, a few photos, a hospital bracelet with my name on it in ink that had faded to a stubborn blue. There were letters, too, in my aunt's handwriting, in a social worker's, in my mother's. One of them was a form with a date before I was born, and words like assistance and options and temporary placement. Another was a note from my aunt that said, "You don't have to do this alone." There was a photo of my mother in a hospital bed, eyes red, holding me like she was holding something fragile and heavy at the same time. Ethan sat on the floor and read over my shoulder, quiet. They were going to, he started. Maybe, I said. The word felt like a small bridge between two cliffs of not knowing. We sat there and put the story together the way you do when you don't have all the pieces, only enough to see the outline. My parents were young, there had been money problems, there had been a moment when the future looked like a door they didn't know how to open. They'd chosen to keep me, they'd chosen to stay, and somewhere along the way that choice had turned into a ledger they kept in their heads, a balance sheet where my existence was always written in red. I didn't remember any of this, Ethan said softly. Of course you don't. You were the miracle. He winced, not at the word, but at the way it sounded now. That's not fair, to you or to them. Fair is a word we use when we're tired of arguing with reality, I said, and then I surprised myself by smiling a little. I'm not here to put them on trial. I wanted to know. We put everything back like we found it because some discoveries are about seeing, not taking. When my mother came home later, she found us at the kitchen table, not talking, just existing in the same space, like we were trying to learn a new arrangement. She looked from one face to the other and said, "What is this?" I told her we'd looked in the closet. The word why formed on her lips and died there. She sat down slowly. I didn't think you'd ever... I didn't either, but then I heard you. The silence that followed wasn't hollow, it was full, like a room finally holding the furniture it was meant for. I was tired, she said at last, and the way she said it made it clear she had been tired for a long time. I was afraid. I didn't know how to be what you needed, so I told myself a story where you were the weight instead of the reason I was carrying it. I waited for the word sorry, but I didn't demand it. You still told it, I said. She nodded. Every day, she admitted, and every day it made it easier to be smaller with you. There it was, not an apology, not a defense, a truth that didn't make anything better and didn't pretend to do it. Ethan stood up and went to make tea, the way he always does when he doesn't know what else to do. We talked in careful sentences after that about money and fear and choices and the strange ways love can get tangled up with resentment until you can't tell which is which without cutting something. When I left, my mother hugged me differently, not better, different. On the bus back to my apartment, I realized I wasn't waiting for a version of my parents who could rewrite my childhood. I was waiting for myself to decide what I'd carry forward, and for the first time, that felt like something I might be able to choose. The weeks after the reunion moved with a strange, cautious quiet, like the air after a storm when you keep listening for thunder even though the sky looks clear. My mother texted me once to ask if I'd gotten home safe, which shouldn't have felt monumental, but it did. My father sent a link to an article about budgeting apps with the message, "Thought this might help." And I laughed out loud on the bus because some habits are so deeply carved they show up even when you're trying to change. Ethan called more, not to report, not to mediate, just to talk. We started building a new kind of conversation out of small, ordinary things. What he cooked, what I read, the way the city smelled after rain. I didn't tell him how much it meant because I didn't want to turn it into something that could be dropped. In class, I found it easier to raise my hand. At work, I stopped apologizing before I asked for things that were part of my job anyway. None of it was dramatic. It was more like discovering a room in a house you've lived in forever and realizing you don't have to crouch there. But the story wasn't done with me yet. About a month later, Aunt Clara called and said she'd found more tapes. "I'm not saying we should watch them," she said, already saying it. "I'm just saying, if there's anything else, it's better in the light." I told her I'd think about it, which is what you say when you already know the answer and you're just giving yourself time to catch up. We met at her place on a Saturday that felt too bright for serious things. The living room was crowded with plants and sunlight and the kind of order that comes from wanting people to feel welcome. My parents came too. We sat on the couch like strangers who shared a long commute once. Ethan took the floor, leaning against the coffee table, a mediator without a gavel. The first tape was nothing, really. Birthday candles, off-key singing, my aunt telling someone to stop blocking the camera. The second had a Christmas morning where my father wore a sweater he'd pretend to hate later, and my mother laughed at something I said, actually laughed, and for a second I wanted to reach into the screen and keep that version of us like a pressed flower. Then there was another kitchen, another angle, another day. My mother's voice again, softer this time, saying, "I don't want him to hear it." My father said, "He hears everything." And she said, "Then we'll whisper." The room went still in that way it does when you realize you're about to learn something you can't unlearn. "I don't regret him," she said. "I regret how small I feel when I look at what we have left after we count him." My aunt, off camera, said, "That's not his fault." And my mother said, "I know, that's what makes it worse." The tape ended there, and nobody rushed to fill the silence this time. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't absolution. It was a window into a woman who had been afraid of her own life and had taken it out on the part of it she couldn't leave. "That doesn't excuse it," Ethan said, not accusing, just stating. My father nodded. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." My mother stared at her hands. "I didn't know how to stop," she said. "Every time I tried, it felt like lying." "You were already lying," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "Just to yourself." She looked up at me then, really looked, like she was seeing a person instead of a column in a budget. "What do you want from me?" she asked. It was the most honest question she'd ever asked me. I thought about apologies and explanations and all the scenes I'd rehearsed where she finally said the right words and I finally felt different. "I want you to stop calling me that," I said, "even in your head." She swallowed. "I can try," she said, and for once, try sounded like work instead of a placeholder. We didn't watch the rest of the tapes. We made tea, we talked about neutral things and not neutral things, and how strange it is to be both someone's child and someone's witness. When I left, Aunt Clara hugged me and said, "You're braver than you think," which I've learned is sometimes code for, "You're still standing." On the walk to the bus stop, Ethan asked, "Are you okay?" I considered the question like it was a new language. "I'm more," I said finally. He laughed. "That tracks." A few days later, my father invited me to dinner. Just me. That had never happened. He cooked, which was also new, and we ate pasta that was a little too salty and pretended not to notice. Halfway through, he said, "I kept a list once." "A list of what?" I asked. "Of costs," he said. "Rent, food, clothes, school stuff." I told myself it was being responsible, but I think I was really trying to turn fear into math. He looked embarrassed, which was almost more disarming than if he'd been angry. "I crossed your name off it after the reunion," he said. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because you want me to know you're trying," I replied. He nodded like a kid who'd just been given the words for something he'd been holding. "Yeah," he said, "that." We didn't hug, we didn't have a movie moment, but when I left, he said my name like it was just a name, not a verdict, and that mattered. The real test came a few weeks later when my mother called and asked if I could help her with some paperwork. I went, braced for old patterns. We sat at the table with the window open, the same light that had once made her look so tired. She kept stopping herself when she spoke, like she was catching a habit midair. At one point, she said, "You know, when you were little, you used to line up your blocks by color." And she smiled, a small, private smile. It made me think maybe order could be learned. I waited for the turn, for the sentence to end in a familiar place. It didn't. We finished the forms. She thanked me. I went home. That night, I wrote in a notebook I'd been carrying around for years without using, a notebook I'd been saving like some people save candles for a power outage. I wrote, "I am not a ledger. I am not a mistake that learned to walk. I am not the word they used when they were afraid." I didn't know if I believed it yet, but I wrote it anyway, because sometimes you have to give your brain a script before your heart can learn the lines. The next semester, I applied for an internship I would have talked myself out of before. When I got it, I told Ethan first. He whooped like I'd won a marathon. I told my parents after. My father said, "That's great," like he meant it. My mother said, "I'm proud of you." And I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time after we hung up, not because it fixed anything, but because it changed the direction of a sentence that had been going the same way for years. There were still bad days. There were still moments when the old word tried to climb back into my mouth like a reflex. But now I had other words. Now I had a story that wasn't just what had been said to me, but what I'd chosen to answer with. And somewhere in the background of my life, like a river that keeps doing its work, the idea of that reunion recording kept shifting from something that had hurt me to something that finally told the truth out loud. The next semester, I applied for an internship I would have talked myself out of before. When I got it, I told Ethan first. He whooped like I'd won a marathon. I told my parents after. My father said, "That's great," like he meant it. My mother said, "I'm proud of you." And I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time after we hung up, not because it fixed anything, but because it changed the direction of a sentence that had been going the same way for years. There were still bad days. There were still moments when the old word tried to climb back into my mouth like a reflex. But now I had other words. Now I had a story that wasn't just what had been said to me, but what I'd chosen to answer with. And somewhere in the background of my life, like a river that keeps doing its work, the idea of that reunion recording kept shifting from something that had hurt me to something that finally told the truth out loud. The next semester, I applied for an internship I would have talked myself out of before. When I got it, I told Ethan first. He whooped like I'd won a marathon. I told my parents after. My father said, "That's great," like he meant it. My mother said, "I'm proud of you." And I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time after we hung up, not because it fixed anything, but because it changed the direction of a sentence that had been going the same way for years. There were still bad days. There were still moments when the old word tried to climb back into my mouth like a reflex. But now I had other words. Now I had a story that wasn't just what had been said to me, but what I'd chosen to answer with. And somewhere in the background of my life, like a river that keeps doing its work, the idea of that reunion recording kept shifting from something that had hurt me to something that finally told the truth out loud. The next semester, I applied for an internship I would have talked myself out of before. When I got it, I told Ethan first. He whooped like I'd won a marathon. I told my parents after. My father said, "That's great," like he meant it. My mother said, "I'm proud of you." And I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time after we hung up, not because it fixed anything, but because it changed the direction of a sentence that had been going the same way for years. There were still bad days. There were still moments when the old word tried to climb back into my mouth like a reflex. But now I had other words. Now I had a story that wasn't just what had been said to me, but what I'd chosen to answer with. And somewhere in the background of my life, like a river that keeps doing its work, the idea of that reunion recording kept shifting from something that had hurt me to something that finally told the truth out loud. The next semester, I applied for an internship I would have talked myself out of before. When I got it, I told Ethan first. He whooped like I'd won a marathon. I told my parents after. My father. The internship started in a building that smelled like fresh paint and ambition, and on my first day I stood in the elevator with a dozen other people pretending not to look at one another's nerves. I kept thinking about how many years I trained myself to disappear into corners, and now here I was, learning how to take up just enough space to be seen without apologizing for it. My supervisor, Mara, spoke in clear sentences and expected answers that matched them. The first time she asked for my opinion in a meeting, my instinct was to offer a caveat, a preemptive sorry, but I heard my own voice instead say, "I think we're missing the long-term cost," and then I explained what I meant. Nobody laughed, nobody rolled their eyes, they wrote it down. I walked back to my desk like I'd just crossed a bridge I didn't know was there. At home, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother that said, "How was your first day?" I stared at it for a minute, then typed, "Good. I think I can do this." She replied with a single word, "Good." It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a transformation, it was a brick laid where a wall used to be. A few weekends later, Ethan came to visit. We went for coffee at a place that made foam art like it was a competitive sport, and he told me he'd broken up with his girlfriend, and I told him about Mara and the meeting and the way the building's windows made the city look like it was trying to be honest with itself. "You're different," he said, not accusing, just noticing. "So are you," I replied, and we laughed because it's easier to admit change when you're not alone in it. He asked if I'd come home for my father's birthday. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I was learning that wanting something doesn't always mean you're ready for all of it. "I'll try," I said, which felt like a real answer. The night before the party, my mother called and said, "I made too much food," which is her way of saying she wants people around. When I arrived, the house was loud in a comfortable way. My father looked surprised to see me, then pleased, then a little unsure of what to do with his hands. We ate, we told the same stories we always tell, but this time I noticed how often my mother stopped herself before speaking, how my father listened instead of planning what he'd say next. At one point, my Aunt Clara pulled me aside and said, "I'm glad you came." And I said, "Me too," and meant it without the old inventory of reasons. After cake, my father opened a small box and took out a watch. "It's not expensive," he said, immediately defensive, then caught himself. It was my dad's." He held it out to me. "I want you to have it." The room went quiet in that way that's more attentive than awkward. I took it, felt its weight, the way time always feels heavier when you hold it in your hand. "Thank you," I said, and this time the words didn't have a receipt attached. On the way home, I kept thinking about the shoebox, about ledgers and lists, about how families keep records even when they swear they don't. A few days later, I got a call from Aunt Clara. Her voice had that careful tone that means she's trying to be brave. "Your mother's been tired," she said, "more than usual." I went over the next evening. My mother was at the table with a stack of papers and a look like she'd been arguing with them. "I hate forms," she said, then smiled at herself like she was surprised by it. We worked through them together. Halfway through, she said, I've been thinking about that word, and my stomach tightened, a reflex I hadn't fully unlearned. Which word? I asked anyway. The one I used, she said. I don't want it in my head anymore. It feels like a shortcut that leads nowhere good. She looked at me. What should I call you? It was a strange question because the answer was so simple and so new. My name works, I said. She tried it, said it out loud like she was testing a note. It sounded ordinary. It sounded like relief. The next week at the internship, Mara asked me to stay late to help finish a project. We ordered takeout and worked until the office lights switched to their after-hours dim. You're good at this, she said. Not as praise exactly, more like a statement of fact. But you hold back. Why? I thought about the kitchen, the tape, the word that had been a compass pointing me away from myself. Habit, I said. She nodded. Break it, she replied, and went back to her screen like she'd given me directions to a place I already knew how to find. When the project launched, my name was on it. It was a small line in a small corner, but it was mine. I took a picture and sent it to Ethan. He replied with a string of fireworks. I sent it to my parents. My father called and said, I showed your uncle, like that was a way of saying he was proud without getting tangled in the word. My mother texted, you earned that, and I let myself sit with the sentence until it stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like furniture. Not everything moved in a straight line. One afternoon, I came home to a voicemail from my mother that started, I don't want to bother you, but, and I felt the old weight settle on my shoulders before I even heard the rest. She needed help moving a bookshelf. That was it. I went, helped, and noticed how quickly my body had gone back to its old script. You don't have to do that, she said, and I almost laughed because that sentence used to mean something else. I know, I said. I want to. We moved the shelf, we drank tea, we talked about a show we both liked. On my way out, she said, thank you, and didn't add anything to it. The real surprise came when my father asked if I'd come fishing with him. We had never gone, not really. He always went with Ethan. Sure, I said, and meant it with curiosity instead of obligation. The lake was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes room for thoughts to stretch. We didn't catch much. We talked about work, about weather, about nothing. Then he said, I used to think being strong meant not asking for help. He watched the line. Turns out it mostly meant not giving it. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. I'm still learning, he added. Me too, I replied, and for once it felt like we were in the same class. On the drive back, he asked if I was happy. The question startled me because it wasn't framed as an audit. Sometimes, I said, more often lately. He nodded like he was writing it down somewhere that wasn't a list. That fall, I went back to Aunt Clara's and helped her organize the rest of the tapes. We didn't watch them. We labeled them and put them in a box and agreed that not every truth needs an audience. You know, she said, that recording didn't change your story. It changed who had to hear it. I thought about that for a long time. At the end of the year, my internship turned into a job. I signed the contract with a pen that felt too light for what it was doing, and then I called Ethan, then my parents. My mother cried, the quiet kind that doesn't try to be the center of the room. My father said, you did this, and didn't add anything else. That winter, when the house got quiet and the city got loud with other people's celebrations, I took the watch out of its box and wound it. It ticked like a small, stubborn heart. I wrote in my notebook again, not a manifesto this time, just a record, meetings, coffee, a good day, a bad day, the way my mother said my name without thinking about it first. I didn't pretend the past had been fixed. I just noticed that the present had more doors. The first year at the job taught me that growth doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It shows up like a chair you keep meaning to fix and then one day realize you've been sitting on it without thinking. I started saying yes to meetings and no to overtime that wasn't mine to carry. I learned which emails needed courage and which just needed a clear subject line. And in the background of all that ordinary learning, my family kept trying in their uneven ways. My mother sent recipes with notes in the margins like a student who wanted extra credit. My father forwarded articles about interest rates and home repairs, then caught himself and wrote, "Sorry, habit," which made me smile because it meant he was paying attention to his own hands. Ethan moved to a new place and asked me to help pick out a couch. We argued about fabric like it mattered, and it did because it meant we were practicing being siblings instead of categories. One afternoon, Mara asked if I'd lead a small team on a short project. The old reflex tried to stand up and wave a white flag, but I sat it back down. Okay, I said. It wasn't brave, it was practical. The team was good, the work was messy, and when it wrapped, someone clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Nice job," like it was a normal thing to say. I walked home under a sky that looked like it had decided to forgive itself for the day. Around that time, Aunt Clara invited us all to dinner. Not a reunion, she promised, just food. I arrived with a bottle of something inexpensive that still felt like a statement and found my mother already there, setting the table with the kind of care that used to be reserved for guests she wanted to impress. "You're early," she said, then smiled at herself like she was noticing a habit changing. My father came in with Ethan and a bag of bread that was too much for the number of people, and we laughed about it. Over soup, my aunt told a story about a neighbor's dog that had learned to open the fridge, and my mother laughed in that unguarded way I'd only seen in old videos. Halfway through, my aunt said, "Do you remember when you lined up your toys by color?" And my mother said, "I do." And then she looked at me and said, "You were very patient," like she was offering a small amendment to the record. I didn't make a ceremony of accepting it. I just nodded and kept eating. After dessert, my aunt brought out a stack of old photos, not the tapes. We spread them across the table like a map. There was me with a gap-toothed smile, me in a too big coat, me holding a ribbon like it might float away. There were my parents, younger and less certain. There was Ethan, always mid-motion. "We didn't keep many," my father said, and then, catching himself, added, "We should have." It wasn't a confession, it was a sentence you could build something on. The winter turned into spring, and the city did that thing where it pretends to start over. One Saturday, my mother called and asked if I wanted to go with her to a plant sale. "You don't have to," she added quickly, like she was practicing a new language. "I want to," I said, and meant it in the way you mean wanting without bargaining. We walked between tables of green and names I couldn't pronounce, and she told me which ones died easily and which ones forgave neglect. "That one's stubborn," she said, pointing to something with thick leaves. "It looks like it needs less than it does," I replied, and she laughed, then caught my eye and nodded, like she'd heard the second meaning too. We bought 2 small pots and split a flat of herbs. At her place, we put one on the windowsill and one in my hands. "For your kitchen," she said. It was a small thing. It stayed. The next week, my father showed up at my apartment with a toolbox. "Your sink makes a noise," he said, like it was a diagnosis. He fixed it, and then, because habits die hard, he started to explain the process in the tone of someone delivering a receipt. He stopped. "You didn't ask," he said. "Sorry." "It's okay," I replied. "I like knowing." He looked relieved, like he'd just been given permission to be useful in a new way. We sat on the floor afterward and drank water from mismatched glasses. "I'm not good at this," he said, meaning everything. "Me neither," I said. We watched the clock tick, the one he'd given me, and for a moment it felt like time was something we were both learning to share. Not everything stayed smooth. There was a family gathering where my mother slipped and said, "We couldn't afford that when," and then stopped herself mid-sentence, eyes flicking to me like a check. I felt the old heat in my chest, then watched it cool. "It's okay," I said. "You can finish a sentence without me in it." She nodded, grateful and a little ashamed, which is a complicated face to see on someone who raised you. That summer, I went on a short trip with friends from work. I sent my parents a picture of a sunrise, like a postcard I didn't have to earn. My mother replied, "Be safe," and my father replied, "Have fun," and neither added a budget tip. Ethan texted a meme about airports, and I laughed out loud in a terminal full of strangers. When I came back, there was a message from Aunt Clara asking if I could help her clean out the garage. "We could make it a 2-person job," she wrote, which is code for, "I want company." We spent the afternoon sorting boxes and telling stories that weren't assigned to any moral. In the corner was another shoebox, not the same one, with a different sticker. "Those are yours," she said. Inside were school projects I didn't remember, a ribbon, a note I'd written her once that said, "Thank you for listening," in crooked letters. "I kept them," she said, like an apology and a pride all at once. I took the box home and put it under my bed, not to hide it, just to know where it was. The job offered me a small raise, I told my parents. My father said, "Congratulations," and didn't say anything else. My mother said, "You should celebrate," and then sent me a recipe like a party favor. I did celebrate, quietly, with a friend and a piece of cake that tasted like almond and something like relief. One evening, Ethan called and said, "They're different with me too," and I knew exactly what he meant. "They ask me things," he said, like actually ask. We sat on our separate couches and listened to each other breathe through the phone for a second, and then he said, "I'm glad you're my sibling," and I said, "Me too," and that was the whole sentence. The anniversary of the reunion came and went without ceremony. I noticed because my calendar reminded me and I turned the notification off, not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't want it to be a holiday. That night, I wrote in my notebook again, not about the past, but about a meeting that went well, and a plant that needed more light, and a watch that needed winding. My mother called a few days later and said, "I've been thinking about names," and I braced, then realized she meant the names of the herbs we'd planted. "Which one's which?" she asked, and I told her, and we both got one wrong. At my birthday, my father sent a card with a simple message inside. "I'm glad you're here." I read it twice, then once more like it might change if I blinked. I didn't frame it. I put it in the shoebox with the rocket sticker and the other one with the crooked note, not as evidence, as context. The past didn't disappear. It stopped being the only story in the room. And that, I was learning, is a kind of peace you build, not something you inherit. The second year at work arrived like a longer stride, not faster, just more certain. I stopped counting how many times I spoke in meetings and started paying attention to what happened after I did. Projects overlapped, names changed, but the feeling of not having to shrink stayed with me like a good habit. Mara asked me to mentor a new hire, and the word mentor made me laugh because it sounded like a coat 2 sizes too big. But then I realized I was already wearing it. The new hire, Lena, asked questions the way people do when they still believe questions are allowed. "How do you know when to push back?" she asked one afternoon, and I thought about a kitchen, a river, a room that went quiet and said, "When the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of being wrong." She wrote it down like it was something you could use later. At home, the plant my mother and I had bought was growing sideways toward the light. I turned it a little every week, not to correct it, just to remind it there were options. My mother noticed. "It looks happier," she said. "So do you," I replied, and she took that in without arguing. My father called one Saturday and asked if I wanted to help him sort through the garage. "I keep things," he said, like it was a confession. "So do I answered, and meant more than boxes. We spent the afternoon deciding what belonged to the past and what belonged to a shelf. He told me stories I'd never heard about his own father, about how men learn to be quiet when they don't have better tools. "I thought I was protecting us," he said, holding a broken radio. "From what?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "From being poor forever," he said, and I understood that sentence in a new way, not as an excuse, but as a map of where he'd been walking without realizing it. We kept a few things. We let the rest go. When we were done, he sat on an upturned bucket and said, "I don't say this enough," and then he did, which is sometimes how people learn. Ethan came over later with pizza and a story about a neighbor who practiced saxophone at midnight. We sat on the floor and laughed, and it felt ordinary in a way that still surprised me. That spring, Aunt Clara had a small health scare that turned out to be mostly a warning and a stack of new prescriptions. We took turns driving her to appointments. In waiting rooms that smelled like coffee and worry, she told me about the year I was born, about how she'd wanted to take me home with her for a while just to give my parents a break, and how my mother had said, "If I let go, I won't get him back," like love was something you could misplace. "She was afraid of losing you even when she was pushing you away," my aunt said, not to defend, just to name a paradox. On the drive home, I thought about how fear teaches people to build walls and then pretend they're houses. The summer brought heat that made the city feel like it was breathing on you. My job sent me to a conference in another state. I almost didn't tell my parents, not out of secrecy, just out of habit. When I did, my mother said, "Send pictures," and my father said, "Good luck," and neither asked how much it cost. At the conference, I spoke on a panel. My voice didn't shake. Afterward, a stranger said, "That was helpful," and I wrote that down later like it was a receipt for courage. On my phone that night, there was a message from Ethan, a picture of my parents' backyard with the caption, "They finally fixed the crooked step." I smiled at the timing. When I got back, my mother asked me to teach her how to use a new app on her phone. "I don't like feeling stupid," she said, which was the closest she'd come to naming something that had been running her for years. "You're not, you're learning." She practiced saying that sentence out loud like it might be a charm. One evening, she surprised me by asking about my childhood, not in the general way people ask to fill time, but specifically, "What did you want that you didn't ask for?" she said. The question felt like a door opening onto a room I'd been cleaning for years. "A desk lamp," I said, because it was true and because it was small enough to carry. "I used to do homework in the hallway light so I wouldn't turn mine on." She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them and said, "I'm sorry," without adding anything else. We went to a store the next day and bought a lamp that wasn't special and exactly right. I didn't need it anymore. I kept it anyway. That fall, my father had a minor surgery that turned into a few weeks of forced stillness. I brought soup. He asked questions about my work, real ones. He told me he'd been reading a book about money and families and how numbers can become a language for feelings people don't know how to say. "I think I spoke that language too much," he said. "I'm trying to learn another." We watched a game neither of us cared about and argued about nothing. When he left, he said, "Drive safe," and then after a beat, "Thanks for coming." I realized he was practicing gratitude the way some people practice scales. The holidays came and went with less tension and more planning. We made lists that were about groceries and movies, not about who owed whom. At dinner, my mother told a story about me lining up blocks by color, and this time she ended it with, "You were so focused," like it was a compliment that had been waiting. Ethan raised his glass and said, "To learning," and we all drank to that, even though learning tastes different to everyone. The following January, I got an email about a promotion. It wasn't huge. It was real. I sat on my bed and let the room stay quiet for a minute, then called Ethan, then my parents. My father said, "You earned it," like it was a fact he'd been saving. My mother said, "I'm proud of you." And this time, I didn't stare at the wall afterward. I made dinner. Life kept doing its unremarkable miracles. A few weeks later, Aunt Clara called and said she was cleaning out her study and found one last tape. "I won't play it," she quickly said. "I just thought you should know." The word tape still had a way of tightening my shoulders, but it loosened just as quickly. "Thank you," I said. "We don't have to." We met for lunch instead and talked about books and recipes and the way time makes you braver about throwing things away. That spring, my mother and I repotted the herbs. She handled the roots like they were something that could feel. "They'll need room," she said, and then laughed at herself like she'd heard a metaphor. "We all do," I replied. At work, Lena presented a project and did well. She thanked me later and said, "You didn't let me hide," like that was a gift. I thought about how many years I'd hidden because I'd been told there was a cost to being seen. I thought about a river and a room and a word that used to be a name. One night, I took the shoe boxes out from under my bed and sorted them. I didn't throw anything away. I just changed the order. I put the watch card on top. I put the crooked thank you note next to the promotion email I'd printed like an old person. I added a picture Ethan had taken of the three of us at the lake, not smiling for the camera so much as because something in the air had finally loosened. I wrote in my notebook, "Not a ledger, not a burden, a person with time." And then I closed it, because sometimes you don't need to keep saying a thing once it's learned how to stay. The year the city finally fixed the sidewalk in front of my building, I realized how much I'd learned to live around small hazards without naming them. The cracked square had been there since I moved in, a place everyone stepped over without thinking. When it was gone, I still lifted my foot higher for a few days, like muscle memory arguing with evidence. Change is like that. It lingers in your body longer than it needs to. At work, the promotion meant my calendar looked like a game of Tetris, but I liked the way the days stacked. Lena started mentoring someone else and told me I stole your line about the cost of staying quiet, like it was a family recipe. I told her to keep it. At home, the herbs had become real plants, the stubborn one especially, thick leaves like it was holding on to something it didn't want to name. My mother came over one afternoon with a bag of soil and an apology that wasn't really an apology. "I forgot to water mine," she said. "I was hoping we could, we repotted it together. Hands dirty, the window open. I'm bad at routines," she said. "I always have been." "You're good at trying again," I replied, and she smiled like she was putting that sentence somewhere safe. That summer, my father asked me to help him draft a will. The word felt heavy in my mouth, but he said it like a practical thing, like changing oil. "I want it to be clear," he said, "no surprises." We sat at his kitchen table and talked about numbers and names and the difference between equal and fair. When we got to personal items, he paused. "The watch stays with you," he said. And then, after a moment, "Not because you need it, because I want you to have it." The sentence mattered more than the object. Ethan joined us halfway through with sandwiches and opinions. "You're both being morbid," he said, and then sat down and helped anyway, because that's who he is. When we finished, my father looked tired and lighter at the same time. "Thank you," he said, and didn't rush away from the word. A few weeks later, Aunt Clara invited us to a small picnic by the river. The same river, a different day. We brought too much food. We always do. We sat on blankets and watched kids throw rocks like they were trying to skip time. My aunt told stories that had nothing to do with us, which was a gift. At one point, my mother went to get napkins and came back with a look on her face that meant she'd been thinking without telling anyone. "Do you remember the reunion?" she asked, and the air did that small tightening thing. "I do," I said. "I think about it sometimes," she continued. "Not the tape, the way the room felt afterward, like something heavy had been moved and nobody knew where to put it." "We're still finding places," Ethan said, practical as ever. She nodded. "I'm trying to put it somewhere that doesn't block the door," she said, and it was the most honest metaphor she'd ever used. At work, I was asked to speak at another conference. This time, I didn't almost say no. I told my parents. My father said, "When is it?" like he might write it down. My mother said, "Wear the blue jacket," like she was offering armor. After the talk, someone asked me how I'd learned to present like that, and I thought about kitchens and lakes and waiting rooms and a word that had been a wall. "Practice," I said, because that's true, and because the rest would take longer than the coffee break allowed. That fall, Ethan got engaged. He called me first, breathless, like he'd just run upstairs. "Don't tell them yet," he said. "I want to do it in person." We planned the moment like a small heist. At dinner, he stood up and said her name and his, and then said, "Marry me," like it was a sentence he'd been rehearsing with his whole life. She said yes. My mother cried. My father clapped and then laughed at himself for clapping. I hugged Ethan and felt a familiar mix of pride and that old echo of being the other one, and then watched it pass like a cloud that knows it's not in charge of the sky. Wedding planning is a masterclass in opinions. My mother discovered a talent for centerpieces. My father discovered a talent for spreadsheets. I was put in charge of music because, as Ethan said, "You're the calm one," and I laughed because that used to be code for something else. At one point, my mother pulled me aside and said, "I want to say something at the rehearsal dinner," and waited like she was asking permission to be loud. "You should," I said. She nodded, relieved and scared. A few weeks before the wedding, my job hit a rough patch. A project stalled. A client got loud. Old instincts knocked like they had a right to be there. I went for a walk by the river and let the noise of it argue with my head. When I got back, there was a message from my father. "How's work?" It wasn't an audit. It was a question. I told him the truth. He listened. He said, "You've handled harder." And I realized he wasn't talking about money. The wedding day was warm and chaotic and full of small disasters that became stories by dessert. My mother's speech was short. "We don't always say the right things when we're afraid," she said, looking at Ethan and then for a half second at me. "But we can learn to say better ones." My father cleared his throat and said nothing, which for him was a kind of punctuation. Afterward, there was dancing and laughing and a picture someone took of the four of us that looked like we were in the middle of becoming something instead of posing as it. A month later, I got a call from Aunt Clara. Her voice was steady but tired. "They found something," she said. "It's early, they're optimistic, but it's something." We rallied, like families do, with schedules and casseroles and awkward jokes. In hospital rooms that smelled like antiseptic and hope, she told me, "I'm not scared, I'm annoyed." I laughed and held her hand. My mother sat with her and learned how to be quiet in a new way. My father learned how to make lists that weren't about money. We took turns being brave. During one long afternoon, my aunt said, "Do you remember that tape?" And I said, "Yes." "I wish I'd turned it off sooner," she said. "I'm glad you didn't," I replied, and surprised both of us. "It moved something," I added. "It didn't fix it, but it moved it." She nodded. "Sometimes that's the job," she said. The treatment worked, slowly. We celebrated small wins with bad coffee and good news. Life narrowed and widened at the same time. At work, the project recovered. At home, the plant survived another season. One evening, my mother called and asked if I'd come over just to sit. She said, "I don't need anything, I just don't want to be alone tonight." I went. We watched a show we both pretended was just okay. Halfway through, she said, "I think about you as a baby sometimes," and I waited. "You were loud and stubborn, and I loved you. I just didn't know how to not be afraid of what that meant." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't explain. She told a truth that had room in it. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said. "I'm afraid of not being enough." "Welcome to the club," I replied, and she laughed, the real kind. That winter, snow made the city quiet in a way that feels like permission. I took out the shoe boxes and the watch and the notebook and made tea and wrote about a wedding and a hospital and a plant that leaned toward light. I wrote about a word that had once been my name and now felt like a story someone else had told me about myself. I didn't cross it out. I underlined a different sentence instead. On New Year's Eve, we stood on my parents' porch and watched fireworks we didn't need to drive anywhere to see. My father said, "I'm glad you're here," like it was a fact he'd checked and rechecked. My mother said my name like it was an answer to a question she'd finally learned to ask. Ethan threw an arm around my shoulders and said, "Next year's gonna be wild," and I believed him in the ordinary way you believe in weather. When the noise died down, we went inside and made too much food. I noticed how the house felt less like a ledger and more like a place you could leave a coat. I noticed how my body didn't brace when my phone buzzed. I noticed how time, when you stop trying to keep score, starts to feel like something you can share. And somewhere in the quiet after, I realized that the story wasn't over because stories like this don't end so much as they learn how to breathe. The day started like any other, the sun slipping through the blinds and thin lines across the floor, and I felt the familiar mix of excitement and ordinary fatigue that comes from a life finally feeling like it's mine. It was my first morning of having both a home and a history I could look at without flinching. I poured coffee and sat with my notebook, the pages full of small victories, quiet observations, and reminders that the past doesn't get to dictate the sentences you write for yourself. A text from Ethan popped up. "Are you ready for today?" I smiled. Today wasn't work and it wasn't school. It was family. My family, together again in a way that wasn't about reckoning, but about showing up. My parents called first, with the same awkward warmth that comes from people trying to measure a moment they've been learning to hold. "See you at noon," my mother said. My father sent a thumbs-up emoji. Ethan and I got there a little early, like usual, and helped set up chairs and plates, and I realized I was thinking about how far we'd come without ever pretending the journey was painless. When my mother walked in, she carried a casserole that had spilled slightly over the edges of the dish. "It's a mess," she said, almost embarrassed. "It's perfect," I told her, and she paused, blinking, as if she had never heard that sentence applied to anything she'd made. My father carried a small stack of books and a board game from his childhood, dusty with time. He looked at me and said, "I hope we can do this right this time," which was more of a hope than a promise, and I nodded because that's enough sometimes. The first part of the afternoon was quiet, a warm hum of people arranging plates, pouring drinks, and opening doors for each other. My Aunt Clara arrived with a box of old photos and a careful smile. She set it down and said, "I thought we could remember, not judge." That sentence felt like a truce. We spread the photos across the table, and as we flipped through them, we laughed at awkward haircuts, crooked smiles, and fashion choices that should never have existed. Somewhere between a photo of my father holding me as a baby and one of Ethan with frosting on his nose, the room shifted. It wasn't the photos themselves, it was that we were together, looking back without pretending we could change it, and looking forward without pretending it wouldn't matter. At one point, my mother paused over a picture of me sitting alone in the park. "I see now that you always found a way," she said softly, "even when we didn't see you fully." Her words landed gently, like a door opening a crack. I didn't need to reply right away. I just nodded and let the sentence settle. Lunch was served, and the conversation moved from memories to small, ordinary things. What herbs grew best on windowsills, which movies had the worst endings, how Ethan had managed to kill another houseplant. My father laughed, really laughed, in a way that sounded like practice, but was genuine all the same. After dessert, Aunt Clara pulled out a small recording device. I braced myself, expecting another tape, another revelation. But she didn't press play. She held it in her hands and said, "This isn't for you to hear, it's for me. I want you to know I've kept every word, but only as a reminder that fear doesn't define a person forever." My hands unclenched without me realizing it. That single act of restraint was louder than any confession or apology. Later, when everyone went outside, the sky was a soft blue, the kind that doesn't shout but makes room for reflection. We wandered toward the river, the same river that had once carried my thoughts away when I was young and fearful. Ethan skipped a stone and missed, laughed, and threw another. My father followed, clumsy but smiling. My mother walked beside me, hands in her pockets, a careful rhythm in her steps. "I almost forgot," she said, glancing at me. "There's something I've wanted to tell you for a while." My heart caught, not with fear, but with readiness. "When you were little," she continued, "I used to think every mistake you made would crush me. I thought I couldn't survive it. I told myself you were the burden because it was easier than admitting I was scared of failing you." She stopped, looked at the river, and then back at me. "But I see it differently now. You weren't the burden, you were the reason I had to become better." Her voice shook slightly, and I felt a lifetime of tension loosen. "I don't need you to fix the past, just to speak truth when you can." She nodded. The breeze caught her hair, and for the first time, I could hear the quiet pride she had always hidden behind fear. My father stepped closer. "I never understood how to tell you, but I want you to know I am proud of you. No calculations, no lists, just proud." I blinked, and the word landed without hesitation. "Thank you," I said. Ethan put his arm around both of us, a bridge in physical form. We stayed like that for a long time, letting the river and the wind fill the silence. Afterward, we returned inside, and Aunt Clara brought out the photos and organized them into albums for us all. Each image, each memory, felt lighter because it had been seen, acknowledged, and accepted. Later that evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the room quiet, and the realization came over me. The word burden existed, but it no longer had power. It was just a story we had survived, nothing more. I thought about the shoeboxes, the tapes, the countless moments of fear and misunderstanding, and I understood that life doesn't always grant closure the way a movie does. It gives it slowly, in gestures, in small truths, in the quiet courage of saying the right word at the right time. I pulled out my notebook and wrote, "I am not a ledger. I am not a burden. I am a person who can love and be loved without measure." I paused, took a sip of tea, and watched my mother folding napkins nearby, her back straight, her hands steady. My father tinkered with a chair, humming softly. Ethan sketched something on a napkin. Each of them was present, imperfectly perfect, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with obligation. Over the next few months, life continued quietly. I celebrated small wins at work, lent advice to Lena than she asked, and spent Sundays helping Aunt Clara with her garden. My parents called more often, not out of guilt, but because they wanted to. I called them not out of habit, but because I wanted to share. The river continued to run past the city, a steady witness. One afternoon, I looked at the shoeboxes and realized they weren't containers of pain anymore. They were markers of growth, of resilience, of the fact that we had all learned to see each other without fear. I opened one and touched the watch, the crooked note, the photos. Each item felt lighter, as though it had been waiting for me to catch up. And I understood fully that the reunion recording had done its work, not by changing the past, but by illuminating the truth and giving me the space to reclaim my name. The burden had been nothing but a sentence spoken in fear. I had survived it, and in the process, my parents had survived themselves. Sitting at the kitchen table with the warm light falling across the room, I felt a sense of completion, not because the story was perfect, but because it was real. I could see the cracks, the mistakes, the times we'd all been human, and instead of anger or shame, there was understanding. There was love, and that, I realized, is the story that lasts. The lesson was clear and quiet. Sometimes the words people speak are not truths, but fears in disguise. And sometimes it takes a long time and patience and witnessing to reclaim your name and your worth. By forgiving without forgetting, by acknowledging fear without being imprisoned by it, we can step into life fully and carry each other in ways that are brave, honest, and enduring. I closed the notebook, stood, and looked out the window. The city was alive, the river steady, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of a word that had once defined me. I felt light, free, whole. And that, after 22 years, was everything.